We're back. The schools are back. MPs are back tomorrow. But can the Prime Minister come back from months in the doldrums when so much is going wrong?
Schools literally crumbling.
It feels incredibly last minute. It feels rather shambolic, if I'm honest.
Air traffic control breaking down.
No one wanted to help us. It was all someone else's issue to fix.
And rail staff and doctors walking out on strike again.
I have no doubt with what's just been announced that a significant amount of elective care, if not all elective care, will be cancelled at our hospital during those periods of strike.
The Prime Minister might have an eager new team in Number 10, but there's a long list of problems and it is still hard to make ends meet. So as MPs return to fill the empty benches, we have one big question this morning. As the election looms into view, can the Prime Minister and his Chancellor get things to work?
The man who lives in number 11, Jeremy Hunt, is live with us today. So is Bridget Phillipson, who wants to take charge of our schools for Labour. A familiar face from our screens, actor Timothy Spall joins us too, rocking out about his new film. We will reveal all later. And from the 70s to the sweetest song, superstar cellist Sheku Kanneh-Mason will take up his bow for us this morning. Morning, morning. It is great to be back. Let's give a warm welcome, not just to you, of course, but to Piers Morgan, broadcaster and chief eyebrow raiser, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, TV chef and campaigner. Hello. And with kids in England about to go back to school, the woman who speaks up for their welfare, the Children's Commissioner for England, Dame Rachel de Souza. A very warm welcome for this new political season. Let's start with a look at some of the newspaper front pages. Quite a mixture today. The front of the Observer, they're leading on the concrete in schools story, saying a whistleblower claims there was a culture of complacency in government. The People says there could be 7,000 more schools at risk of closure. But the Express is leading on our guest this morning, the Chancellor's cost of living pledge to halve inflation. And the Telegraph picks up on another theme of the week. It's saying Rishi Sunak is going to defy the suggestion from the Climate Change Committee that there should be no new airports. We'll get into that a bit later on. But first of all, Rachel, it's almost unbelievable, isn't it? 2 days before schools go back, some schools have been told to close because they're dangerous.
Look, I was as shocked as everybody else when I heard this. And first thing we've got to say is, I mean, my heart goes out to the children and the parents who are affected, who, you know, those children were just getting ready to go back to their first day at school, the most important time. We know the start of the school year sets the tone. Now, I went straight to the Minister's office and I have been repeatedly speaking to the most senior officials on this issue. The first thing I've been stressing is safety. We're now in this mess and we need safety for absolutely every child. Particularly, I'm concerned about the most vulnerable, children in special schools, children who are looked after children, and making sure they're communicated with and that they can start school. We've learnt from the COVID pandemic, the worst thing we did was keep children away from school. We need children to be in school.
And a lot of parents watching this morning might think this is some kind of disaster unfolding, really.
Yeah, well, it needs not to be. Look, I'm sure we'll be looking back on what's happened, and I am extremely disappointed and frustrated that there wasn't a plan in place for this happening. The government might not have known that it would happen this week, but we knew the stock was in this situation.
And there have been warnings about this for years. I mean, Piers, somebody in the Labour Party joked grimly to me that if they'd been looking to try to create a story that made the Tories look rubbish, they couldn't have dreamt this one up.
Well, it's a complete shambles, and of course it reflects the general view that this country is broken and falling apart at the seams. A government's first job should be to keep a roof over our heads, keep us safe. And if you're a young child who's already had years of your education being wrecked, dismantled, distracted. You know, you've not been at school, you've been at home. You know, we know this. We're going to come to this, I'm sure. But the number of kids who just aren't turning up at school now, it's terrifying. And now you have a fact that, well, they can't even, if they do turn up, they've got nowhere to go to because 100 schools are shut. I think it's a complete disgrace. And I have to say, with all due respect to the Chancellor for pitching up today, but where is the Education Secretary?
Well,
I mean, she's putting out these sort of Oscars-style videos.
Are you referring to a clip that they published yesterday?
Yeah, which
but you're
is
right,
just,
she hasn't made herself available.
Sorry, that's not your job. I don't want slick videos. I want the Education Secretary to be being held to account. How has this happened? Apparently, ministers were told 5-6 years ago.
And we'll come to that in a few minutes with Jeremy Hunt. But Hugh, you've been watching carefully the politics of the last week. Now, there was a mini shuffle.
There was.
A Net Zero Secretary, Grant Shapps now in there. You take a keen interest in the environment. As a Green Party member, what do you think of what's happened?
Well, Grant Shapps leaving his post was the best thing that happened in Westminster last week. And the really exciting news is not that he's now Minister of Defence. It's that he's no longer in charge of net zero because his position there was indefensible. I mean, we've seen the country go backwards. We've seen the government go backwards on their net zero commitment over the past year. He was really acting as a minister for fossil fuel and for as yet unproven technologies in the jet fuel industry. And he did nothing to advance the cause. In particular, he's been ignoring one of the biggest problems we have, which is a continuing ban on onshore wind, the cheapest form of electricity and the best way to give us energy security and to bring down our electricity bills.
We'll come to more of that later, and I know all three of you will be keenly, interestingly listening to Jeremy Hunt. Now, crumbling concrete is the latest big problem for the government, grappling with, above all else, a sluggish economy with sky-high prices. Jeremy Hunt has been in charge at the Treasury for nearly a year. His first job was to sort out the chaos after Liz Truss's mini budget. But his next task was to try to get the economy going and help everyone make ends meet. Let's rewind.
Right now, what people want is an honest Chancellor. Spending is not going to increase by as much as people hoped, and indeed, we're going to have to ask all government departments to find more efficiencies than they had planned. And some taxes are going to go up. Good morning, Laura. We are going to see everyone paying more tax. We're going to see spending cuts. But I think it's very important to say that we are a resilient country.
No, we're going to stick it there.
Oh, we're actually sticking it, are we? Sorry, that's a bad idea. There we are.
We've got to hold our nerve, stick to the plan, and we will get through this.
Welcome back to the studio, Chancellor. We'll talk about the economy in a few minutes, but 2 days before children in England were meant to go back to school, we get the news that more than 100 schools and colleges in England are closed or partially closed because they're not safe. How on earth did you allow that to happen?
Well, first of all, Laura, I have enormous sympathy for the parents and children involved. My own daughter went back to school on Thursday. I've got 2 other kids going back to school next week. It's a stressful time anyway, and to have this news at this time adds to that stress. But let's be clear what happened. We had an exhaustive process of going through every one of 22,000 schools in the country since the problem first came to light in 2018.
And that's 5 years ago. So let's be clear what happened here. There have been warnings to government for years and years and years about this. And yet 2 days before kids are meant to be going back to school, suddenly this news out of the blue, that's not good enough, is it?
Well, let me explain to you what happened. Perhaps it'd be helpful to your viewers to know that we went through this exhaustive survey of 22,000 schools after the initial incident in 2018. Then in the summer months, new information came to light that suggested that some of the buildings that had previously been classified as safe might not be. And so the Education Secretary acted immediately on that. It was 156 schools. Measures were taken for a third of them, 52 of them, which meant that they were able to operate completely as normal. The other 100, the majority are still able to function face-to-face at schools.
But you're talking about the action that's been taken in the last couple of weeks, and you've set out why the decision was taken at this particular moment in time. But do you understand why some families might be looking at this and think it just looks like a shambles? The warnings about this have been there for years and years and years. This does not look like the behaviour of a competent government, does it?
Well, I understand the frustrations, but what I would say to every one of those families is that we acted fast when the problem first arose, but when new information comes to light, when
Forgive me, Chancellor, you can't say that you acted first when the information first came to light. The information about the problems with this kind of crumbling concrete came up 5 years ago, and Dame Rachel de Souza, the Children's Commissioner, has told us this morning it's incredibly disappointing.
But Laura, as I said, and I'll try not to repeat myself, that action was taken then, but what happened in the summer months was that buildings that had previously, having been checked after that and classified as safe, the view changed, and we received advice they might not be. So the Education Secretary acted immediately. What I want to say also as Chancellor to parents is that we will spend what it takes to sort out this problem as quickly as possible.
So do you commit to covering whatever costs are required to remove all of this dangerous concrete from schools around the country?
We will spend what it takes to make sure that children can go to school safely, yes. And parents should know that. They should also know that we won't take any risks with their children's safety. So when new information comes to light, however awkward or difficult it is, we will act to make sure their children are safe. And that's what the Education Secretary...
Do you have an idea what that cost might be?
Well, all I can say is that when I have had requests in my time as Chancellor to spend money to deal with this issue, whether it's in schools or whether it's hospitals or whether it's courtrooms or whether it's buildings that belong to the Department of Work and Pensions, we have said, yes, we must spend this money because we need to keep the people who work in these buildings, the children who use them in the case of schools, the patients safe. That is our priority.
And how quickly do you think this can be sorted out? Because I think also a lot of parents, again, understandably, are thinking, might this be the start of something like lockdown, where you had months on end of children not being in their classrooms?
It won't be. And this problem is currently affecting around 100 schools, but the majority of those are able to operate face-to-face. We will deal with them extremely quickly. I know this is what the Education Secretary is doing, but also parents need to know we won't take risks because this is too important and children's safety is our #1 priority.
Could there be more, though? There are suggestions this morning in some parts of the press there could be as many as 7,000 schools affected here.
Well, where we see information that there might be other schools affected, then we take action. That's what we did originally, that's what we will continue to do. And safety, getting kids to school, we will spend what it takes to make that happen.
But is something like 7,000, is that realistic that we could see that kind of number of schools being affected?
Well, I don't want to speculate on these numbers because I think that might scare people unnecessarily.
People want to know. So do you have information?
Well, what people need to know, and they can actually see from the way the government's acted, is that however difficult it is, we will do absolutely what it takes to make sure their kids are safe. That's what I want to know as a dad with my kids, and that's what every parent wants to know, and we will make sure we act in the way that they would want us to act because we're parents as well.
And you said you would do this as quickly as possible. Do you mean a matter of weeks? Do you mean a matter of months? Is it a commitment to sort this out by half term, before Christmas? Can you give us a sense?
Well, what I can give you a sense of is the speed of which we've acted. So originally this problem was 156 schools. It's been dealt with, there's been remediation made in a third of those. We've put in place countermeasures in the majority of the remaining schools. So the number of schools affected has, out of the 22,000 schools we have in total, has reduced to a much smaller number. But you know, as new information comes out, we will continue to act very, very fast.
Did you know that there were hospitals that had racked dangerous concrete in it when you were Health Secretary?
It wasn't something I was aware of being told, but as Chancellor I was told that. In fact, one of the rack hospitals, Frimley Park, is one used by my own constituents in Farnham. And as Chancellor I said, when it comes to prioritising these jobs in amongst all the other pressures on the NHS, we must do this, and that's exactly what Steve Barclay has done.
There are hospitals, though, that are affected. We know there may be court buildings affected, there may be council housing or former council housing affected. As we speak today, could there be patients in hospitals that aren't safe?
Well, if we receive any information that suggests that, then we will take the action that's necessary. But in terms of making sure that hospitals like the ones used by my own constituents are safe, that is the programme that Steve Barclay committed to as Health Secretary a few months ago.
But we know, though, that there have been, for many public buildings, endless delays in buildings programmes. And if you look at the numbers, in schools, for example, the amount of cash spent on investing in school buildings dropped by 50% in real terms between 2009 and 2022, the years that the Conservatives have been in charge. Isn't what's really going on here the fact that decisions made to cut back on public spending on the fabric of our country are coming home to roost, and you literally did not fix the roofs while the sun was shining?
Well, I'm glad you've asked that wider question, because it gets to the heart of what Rishi Sunak and my approach is.
No, hang on, it gets to the heart of what decisions your party has made over the last decade.
Will you let me answer your question, Laura, because it gets to the heart of our approach. So let me say, first of all, yes, in 2010, faced with the biggest financial crisis since the war, a predecessor government that had run out of money, we had to take difficult decisions. But what was the first decision that Rishi Sunak took as Chancellor? It was to increase our capital budget by nearly 40%. That was a huge increase. What did I decide as Chancellor in my first autumn statement? And I remember you interviewing me on the day after I became Chancellor. I protected in cash terms that increase in the capital budget. If we want to spend more on our schools and hospitals, which we do, what do we need to do? We need to grow the economy.
But
and what did we hear?
Today,
because you're asking me about our record.
But let me ask you this question, because this is about why we've ended up in this situation. Do you accept, though, that the decisions, justified though they may have been, but do you accept that the decisions made about cutting back public spending in that era are part of the reason why we've ended up in this situation, whether it's crumbling concrete in schools, whether it's problems in all sorts of other parts of the public services?
No, and the reason I don't is, for example, I've read in the press this morning people talking about the Building Schools for the Future programme that was stopped by Michael Gove. What he did was, as Education Secretary, he halved the cost of building new schools so that more money could be spent on repairs. And as I said to you earlier, the moment we found out there were problems, we've acted on them. The bigger question that we face as a country is, if we want to spend money on our schools and on our hospitals, indeed on our armed forces and other public services, how do we grow the economy? What did we hear on Friday? We heard that our GDP is now 0.6% above pre-pandemic levels. That is better growth following the pandemic than France, Italy, Germany, Japan, taken because of decisions that Rishi Sunak took as Chancellor with the furlough scheme, the bounce back loan scheme. We are utterly focused on growing our economy, and you'll hear lots more about this in the months that come ahead. After we have dealt with inflation, which is the primary task, that is how, in the end, we'll be able to invest in the fabric of the country, and that's what we want to do.
But do you think the average family is really feeling better off? I mean, you're right, there were some revisions to forecasts suggested that the UK wasn't in such a bad position as it had been guesstimated beforehand. But do you think the average family is really feeling a bit more optimistic, as you seem to sound?
Well, they didn't just say that we're not in as bad a position as we thought. They showed that of the major European economies, the UK has had the best recovery. But let me ask that question.
I'm asking you how people feel right now, because the OBR, independent organisation, says we're right in the middle of the biggest fall in living standards for 70 years. And you know yourself how high inflation is, how people are struggling to pay their bills.
Well, you will remember, Laura, in that very first interview that we did when I was Chancellor, the day after I became Chancellor, I promised two things. I said that I would fix the big problems we face, take whatever difficult decisions were necessary, and we've seen the progress in that. Inflation down nearly 40% from its peak at 11%, all the growth forecasts being revised upwards. But I also said I would do it in a fair way that helped families through a very difficult period. And that's why you see measures like the energy price guarantee, capping the average bill at £2,500. You've seen fuel duty kept down 5 pence lower than it would otherwise have been, around £3,000 of support.
When do you think people will start to think, you know what, maybe we are through the worst of this squeeze?
When we get inflation down, and when interest rates can start to fall, because there's a lot of pressure now on families with mortgages. But what people want from a Chancellor, what people want from their Prime Minister is not people who are going to take the easy decisions, but people who are going to take the right decisions for the long term of the British economy. That's what we're doing, and we can see the plan is working. Inflation is coming down.
Well, it may go up. The Bank of England thinks it will go up, has gone up in August. Do you accept that? Do you think that is what's going to happen?
I do think we may see a blip in inflation in September, but after that, the Bank of England is saying it will fall down to around 5%. And if we're going to put money in people's pockets quickly, the fastest thing I can do is to deliver the Prime Minister's pledge to halve inflation, because that puts not 1 pence in the pound, which might be a tax cut, but 5 pence in the pound in people's pockets that they wouldn't have had if inflation stays high.
A lot of people in your party, though, would say, actually, in the autumn statement, your big moment coming up in November, you could put money straight back in people's pockets by cutting taxes.
Well, one of the things I'm most proud of as a Conservative is that as a result of what this government's done, for the first time ever, anyone in this country can earn £1,000 a month without paying a penny of tax or national insurance.
And the tax burden overall is the highest it's been in years and years and years and years and years. So on behalf of your backbenchers or people watching this morning who think, just cut taxes, give us money back in our pockets, should they just forget that for your autumn statement in November? Because we read that's what you've told your officials.
Well, there are two ways that we can bring the tax burden down. And as a Conservative, there is nothing I want to do more. One of them is to grow the economy, and we're making good progress on that. And the second is to spend taxpayers' money more efficiently. And the work that I and my Chief Secretary, John Glenn, have been doing over the summer has identified that our public servants, police officers, teachers, doctors, nurses are spending far too long on admin. So I've written to all my Cabinet colleagues today, responsible for those public services, to ask them exactly how long is being spent on unnecessary admin. And what we need to do now is to restart the public service reform agenda. It's not about asking people to work harder. They work very, very hard, but it's about using money more efficiently.
Successive Conservative governments, other governments before have tried to crack down on this kind of thing, but it rarely changes the dial in a very, very big way at a time when the economy has really been under significant pressure. And your colleague Michael Gove said an interesting thing yesterday. He suggested that young people were getting a raw deal from the government and that it was worth looking at the tax system to make it fairer. Has he got a case?
Well, when you say it rarely moves the dial, I would dispute that. And just to take an area that Michael Gove is well known for, education, because of reforms that we've made, we've actually risen to fourth in amongst all developed countries in terms of our reading standards in schools in England. That is a tremendous amount of progress over the last decade. But let's talk about young people, because Michael was absolutely right to talk about them. What is the best thing that we can do for them? It is to say that this country is going to have the most exciting, best paid, innovative jobs of the future. And if you ask what is Rishi Sunak and my plan for growth, what's our growth strategy? We want the UK to be a global leader in the industries that are going to grow the fastest this century. And I'll just give you one example. In the pandemic, because of medicines and treatments discovered or developed in the UK, 7 million lives were saved across the world. That's more, I think, than any other country. We now have, in the last decade, developed Europe's largest life science industry that is creating brilliant jobs for young people leaving our universities.
Many young people actually look at this country right now and feel pretty fed up. It's very, very difficult to get on the property ladder because they're paying back university loans. They may be hit by extremely high tax rates in reality. And a lot of people also interested in the environment, which we know is a particular interest for the younger generation, look actually at your government seeming to be a bit wobbly on some of its green commitments. We were hearing from Hugh earlier that actually there's a lot of disappointment that the government isn't quite as committed to its net zero goals as it was under Boris Johnson. Are you wobbling on your commitment to the environment?
No, and Rishi Sunak and I have said many times we are incredibly proud of the fact that we have reduced emissions by more in this country than any other major country, and we are legally committed to net zero. That was a Conservative government that passed that law. But we need to get there in a pragmatic and sensible way, and we need to do so in a way that carries people with us. And so that's why the measures that we're taking, let me give you one thing that's happened in the last 10 years. We have become Europe's largest producer of offshore wind energy. And our renewables now account for about 40% of our total electricity, up from I think around 2%. So we're absolutely committed, but we need to do it in a way that recognises that ordinary families are feeling the pinch. They don't want to see their energy bills go up. And if we're to keep their support for this very important agenda, then we have to do it in a pragmatic and balanced way.
OK, life isn't all about politics, and you recently lost your brother Charlie to cancer, to a rare form of cancer, sarcoma. Now, you've spoken about his journey, you've spoken also about your own cancer care, and you and Charlie did a lot of fundraising together. I just wonder if your own experiences have made you feel differently about the health service. You were the health secretary for a long time. You've been a frontline politician making decisions about the NHS for a long time. Has it changed how you think about it?
Well, I think when you lose a brother, something like that, it does change the way you think. My brother was an incredible outdoors person. He loved sport. He twisted my arm to run the marathon, which I'd never done before. He loved kite surfing. And he had this kind of irrepressible positivity. And he said to me in his last days, the one thing that he wanted to happen out of the great sadness of leaving behind a lovely family was that more people would understand the dangers of this very rare cancer, sarcoma. And if you have a lump or a pain in an arm or a leg or the chest or the abdomen, ask your GP if it could be a sarcoma. And also, he and I both want to support an amazing small charity called Sarcoma UK that's doing more research to make sure that other families don't have to go through what our family are going through.
OK, Jeremy Hunt, thank you so much indeed for coming in this morning, and thank you for talking about your brother to us today. Thank you. Now, I'm sure you are all in fine voice as ever. Let us know what you thought of what the Chancellor had to say. You can email me, kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or on social you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay, or you can follow the headlines as they are developing on the BBC Live page. The address is there for you now. Now then, Piers, what did you make of what Jeremy Hunt had to say about the situation with the government?
Well, I think first of all, credit to him and Rishi Sunak for restoring at least some basic decorum to the office of Prime Minister and Chancellor after the fiasco of Liz Truss, the shambles of Boris Johnson. I think they deserve credit for looking like they take the job seriously. But they are obviously inheriting one of the great hospital passes that any government's ever had to inherit. We know from the polls they're very unpopular as a government, as a party. And I had a weird moment. I flew to California at the start of August, spent a month away. And I got on my plane and I found that sitting next to me was the Prime Minister, which was probably the last thing he wanted to encounter on his day one of his vacation. But we had a very nice chat in mid-air. And he was asking what I thought about the situation. I said, you know, it reminds me a little bit of the England cricket team, who went through 17 test matches and won one. And were playing a very dour, uninspiring form of cricket. And we're facing a barrage of bouncers and really just not exciting anybody with the way they were playing. And then we changed everything. We brought in a new captain, Ben Stokes, a new coach, Brendan McCullum. We had this new philosophy called Bazball. And Bazball was about ripping up the rules.
More aggressive,
getting on the
out.
attack, getting on the front foot. And Rishi Sunak's a big cricket fan, and he was like listening to me. And I said, you need to be a bit more Bazball, Prime Minister.
So you're advising the Prime Minister then, up in business class, we assume, up over the Atlantic?
Well, a little bit, but the country, I think, is crying out for hope and inspiration, but also a little bit of excitement. We're all fed up with the malaise which has engulfed this country, aren't we? We're fed up with all the strikes, with the misery, with the NHS problems, with the post-pandemic issues. Everyone is feeling the pinch. Everyone's feeling miserable. And I want to see leadership from the top, from the government, and the Prime Minister and Chancellor in particular, get on the front foot, start playing some shots, get this country back where we think it should belong.
About Rishi Sunak becoming more aggressive this autumn, whether he will start to look like he's coming out fighting more. But it's hard for them to do that, isn't it? And we've got parents this morning wondering if their kids are going to be able to go to school safely this morning. I mean, Rachel, you were obviously pretty angry before we heard from the Chancellor. What did you make of his answers about crumbling concrete?
Look, I'm pleased that each case is going to get funded as it needs and be taken seriously, but we shouldn't even be in this situation. There should have been the planning in place and a really good school building programme that has addressed this over the years. Is it really the least to ask to say that we want safe, fit-for-purpose buildings for children? Now, there is a school priority build programme. There has been money put into special schools. As a head teacher and teacher of 32 years, I've built and refurbed 17 schools. And what I can tell you is there's not enough money in there and it's not moving quickly enough. And there's something about grip here, because companies are funded to build schools, the cost engineering starts. We need far better grip on these issues that really affect children and young people.
So if you've done 17 already, sounds like you need to be out there tomorrow with a hard hat, making sure it all gets there. Hugh, we asked the Jeremy Hunt whether or not the Tories are backsliding on their environmental commitments, and he denied it, but he said we have to take people with us, we have to be pragmatic.
Well, the best way they could possibly take people with them is by investing in the cheapest form of electricity, one that could actually be taking £130 off our bills every year, wipe £5 billion off the cost of energy, and that's onshore wind. It is not oil and gas. And it's interesting that Piers met the Prime Minister on what I assume was a chartered flight. You mentioned, possibly in first class, because his favourite form of transport between meetings seems to be buzzing about in a helicopter, and his favourite turbine is the rotor that goes zipping around above his helicopter. He is not delivering on net zero. His own climate change committee are absolutely clear about that, but we have an energy bill next week with a really exciting opportunity, and thank goodness Grant Shapps isn't there to oversee it. We have Claire Coutinho, the new minister.
New Net Zero Secretary. I'm sure Grant Shapps would disagree with you, but...
Alok Sharma has tabled an amendment that would finally lift this ridiculous ban that actually makes it easier to build a 200-foot-high naked statue of the Prime Minister than a wind turbine that would deliver cheap electricity to the country.
And I know you've been making a documentary about this for Channel 4 in the last few months.
A documentary that, incidentally, the Chancellor has declined to give an interview to my colleague Mary Portas about, which is a great shame. Because
well, maybe you can grab him on the way out after the show. But doesn't he have a point, though, Piers, about being pragmatic and not alienating communities? And particularly, we've seen with ULEZ, for example, a pretty hefty charge going on to people driving particular types of cars. Isn't there a balance here?
I think there is, and I think they've hit the right balance. I think that you've got to be careful. I look at the Just Stop Oil protests. Instinctively, my gut feeling is that they're right.
That's such a distraction to talk about Just Stop Oil.
Okay, but let me... you've had your say. Let me just have mine. I just think the Just Stop Oil protests have had the complete opposite effect to what those protesters hoped or thought they would get. If you're just going to spend your entire time running around wrecking ordinary people's lives, ruining their fun, getting in their faces, stopping them going to school, stopping them going to hospital and so on, you are not going to bring the public with you. The government has to somehow hit this sweet spot where they take us into a far greener place, which is what they want to do, but they do it at a pace and a rate and an affordability that will bring the public with them. And if you try and be too catastrophic in your rhetoric about this, or too, in my view, with Just Stop Oil, pathetic in your methodology, you are going to turn people off, and that will not work.
Hugh, do you think Just Stop Oil have actually shot themselves in the foot? Because a lot of people have been very cross about their activities.
Firstly, nothing's more affordable than onshore wind to bring down our energy bills and give us energy security in the UK. Secondly, Just Stop Oil. Every radical movement for change needs a radical wing that draw our attention to things. I was watching the test match when somebody ran on and exploded some orange powder. That drew some attention to an absolutely vital issue.
Well, hang on, I was there that day, and the only attention it drew was everyone was booing, and everyone thought that guy was a total moron.
We're talking about it now.
Everyone cheered the wicket keeper.
And yet we're talking about it now.
And they've been pretty successful about raising the profile of the issue.
These people are prepared to put their liberty on the line to defend something that they passionately believe in. That's why women are allowed the vote in this country. What would you have been saying when women were throwing themselves in front of the King's horse? In order to get a vote for women, we need people to go out there and put their liberty at risk to show that this generation, as the Chancellor pointed out, as Rachel knows above all else, because 40% of children put climate number 2 when she had the big ask a year ago.
And we're going to come back to that in a second.
Stuff are not coming with them.
Well,
so it's failing as a strategy.
That's a point of argument and it's a point of dispute, and I suppose none of us can get inside the minds of every single member of the public, but the Just Stop Oil activities were a big story over this summer. What was also quite a big story over this summer was the ongoing hacking trial against the Mirror Group. Now, as the former editor, Piers, I know you have denied on many occasions that you had any knowledge of phone hacking while you were the editor, but your name kept being brought up during the trial, and there was a range of testimony that implicated you in the hacking of people's phones. Do you still deny that?
Absolutely. And I was never asked to take part in that trial, by the way, at all. Nobody on either side asked me to appear. I had to put up with a lot of people making all sorts of unsubstantiated claims against me, and we'll wait and see what the verdict is in this case. But there's a wider point here. I think, which is, does the public have any sympathy with Prince Harry about his relentless, vengeful campaign against the media in this country, which you've seen again recently now with what he said about the troops in Afghanistan, that the British media somehow didn't support them? Absolute lie. Harry has gone around in this campaign against the British media spewing lies with his wife, Meghan Markle. I don't think the public here have any sympathy for their privacy. Hang on. You've said a bit about that case, and we'll have to wait and see what that concludes. And my position on hacking remains exactly the same.
And that's
but I'm not going to take lectures. I'm not going to take lectures, Laura, on privacy from a guy like Harry, who has spent the last few years voraciously invading the privacy of his own family for vast financial gain. I think the guy is a shameless hypocrite, and I think the public recognise that.
And he's not here to defend himself, but you've made your view about him very clear. But I do want to ask you if you have ever listened to a voicemail without the consent of one of the participants.
No, I've made it very clear. My position on hacking is I have never hacked a phone. I've never told anyone to hack a phone. No one's produced any evidence, including in this case.
The paper you were editing benefited and ran stories based on phone.
Let him answer the question, and then we want to
make a lot of
to Rachel about
unsubstantiated allegations.
Things.
I saw zero evidence in that case, unless I missed something, that Prince Harry produced a shred of actual evidence that anyone at the Daily Mirror under my leadership hacked his phone.
Now
the judge will make his report, but that is, as we stand here, that is the case. But I do think it's pretty rich of Harry to be lecturing the British media about privacy when he's on this extended whining privacy tour.
And you've made that abundantly clear. Now I want to talk about, Rachel, one of the things that you've been doing a lot of work on over the summer. Kids in England are meant to be going back to school tomorrow. Kids in Scotland are been back at school for a couple of weeks, but you've got some new research showing how many kids have been persistently absent. Now that means missing more one day, at least a fortnight, and the number is extraordinary, 1.8
Absolutely,
million.
Laura. And what I would say is, when I go around and talk to children, and I've talked to thousands of them and take their views, they want to be at school, they want to have the great futures and the great jobs and be part of making this a great country. But we've got a real problem post-pandemic around attendance. Now, I started looking at the data, I kept a close eye on it. We've now got live data. 1.8 million of an 8 million cohort is huge. There are also double the number from before the pandemic, and double the number of severe absence as well, 50% or more.
So what's going on?
A range of things are going on. First of all, I think we have to accept that the effect of the pandemic really hasn't been solved. This number has not got better, it's got worse. When I looked into it, there are a number of things. One is there is a group of children that really are anxious, school refusing on the emotional basis, and we really need to get those children back. And we're working with mental health support, with hospitals, and I'm really trying to bring hospitals and schools together to do that. I've been convening, and that's when I talk about grip in the public sector, that's what we need to be doing. Also children with special educational needs who've just found it easier at home. And then there's a large group of children, 100,000 or so, who are just playing truant and are not come back.
And you're telling them today, Rachel, what are you telling them today?
What I'm saying
Get to school tomorrow?
Well, actually, what I'm saying as well as to parents is you're not on your own, parents. Most children, and I've talked to thousands of them, will think again about September. Could this be the year I do it? So I'm saying to parents, reach out to schools, schools reach out to parents. We need health and the police and everybody working together. If kids don't come back in the first week, they're likely to have 55% of absence. So it's really important.
Tell the parents to get their kids back to school.
And I think you could have been quite a scary head teacher, so I hope that everybody around the country has been listening to Dame Rachel this morning.
The parents should get their kids back to school.
Thank you all for now, and that is a headache for schools and for parents to get kids back to school properly after COVID. But they've also got to deal with dangerous buildings. Now, the politician who would like the job of sorting all of that out is Labour's Bridget Phillipson, who is the Shadow Education Secretary, hopeful of getting into power if Labour wins the next election. She's back in the studio this morning. Thank you. Great to see you after the summer. Now, we just heard there a new figure from Dame Rachel. 1.8 million kids persistently absent. How would you get those kids back to school?
Good morning, Laura. I am really concerned about the impact that we're seeing on young people and their futures. There are a number of key ways that I've set out change that Labour would make to support children and families around school attendance. So, for example, breakfast clubs, delivering breakfast clubs for every primary school child in England. That softer start to the day, making sure that children are properly supported, and it does make a big impact on academic outcomes too. Also, alongside that, improve mental health support in our schools. This is a growing concern, and as we just heard there from the Children's Commissioner, I've heard the same stories about increasing numbers of young people experiencing mental health difficulties, anxiety, and the cost of living pressures too that families are facing. That's also having an impact. It's making it really hard for families. There are enormous challenges, and when you speak to school leaders, they are doing everything that they possibly can. But we never had a proper catch-up recovery programme coming out of the pandemic, and it was Rishi Sunak, who was the Chancellor, who said we maxed out on support for our
also say that parents have got a role. I mean,
Absolutely.
Do parents have to just be tougher and get kids out of the door and not say, oh, if you're not feeling so well, actually, yeah, you can have a day off?
Absolutely. Of course, parents have an important role.
But should they be tougher?
I don't think it's helpful to talk in that kind of language. There are some parents that are struggling themselves with mental health. There are some rising levels of child poverty and cost of living. Of course, every day in school matters. Absolutely, that's a really important message. But just lecturing people without supporting them, I've never found is an effective means of making change happen.
But Labour, when it was in power last time, actually introduced truancy fines. I mean, is that something that you would look at increasing? Because this is a very serious problem, and it sort of feels like something radical might have to be done.
I'm not convinced that increasing fines is the answer. I think you do actually see across the country real variation in how those fines are applied, and parents, I think, rightly raise concern about that. I think this is partly about the post-pandemic response. As I say, Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, said that we'd maxed out on the support available to children. He rejected out of hand the expert report from Sir Kevin Collins, a leading expert in education, that set out what needed to happen coming out of the pandemic. We know how disruptive it was to children's education. We know the impact it has had. And that relationship between schools and families, but also between government and education, I think is fractured. And my priority, if I were Education Secretary, will be to reset those relationships.
But would you cough up all the money that Kevin Collins asked for?
Well, we set out at the time what Labour's plans around that would be. Sadly, that moment passed. The government rejected it. What they put in place, that tutoring programme, sadly has been a total failure. And we will see the impact of that as a country for a very long time to come.
Now, we heard the Chancellor this morning promise that the government would sort out this situation with crumbling concrete as quickly as they possibly could. He also said he would give whatever it takes financially to sort it out. Labour called yesterday for a full audit. What do you think the government should do about this today?
So first, I'm calling on the government to publish the full list of all of the schools affected and publish the papers that are driving all of that. We don't fully know exactly what's going on, and if the government aren't prepared to do it, then we'll force a vote in Parliament next week. We need to understand the scale of what's going on, and it's all very good and well the Chancellor saying that he'll put in place financial support for these mitigations. That's the bare bones of what is required. What we saw under the Conservatives was one of the very first acts of that incoming Conservative government in 2010 was to cancel Labour's Building Schools for the Future programme. That's had a big impact. I mean, the chickens are coming home to roost after 13 years, and I can think of a no more defining image about the last 13 years of Conservative government than children being sat in classrooms under metal props to prevent the ceilings literally falling in on their heads. It is scandalous what they have allowed to happen in our schools, and Rishi Sunak himself as well bears responsibility for this. He cut the budgets too, and now we're going to see good money going after bad for sticking plasters, not a long-term plan.
And yet in Wales, where Labour has control of these things, the government only started surveying their state funding schools for this issue this year.
Because they continued with the school rebuilding programme, unlike in England.
But they didn't need to look at every single school that they had. They weren't looking for dangerous concrete.
They are looking at it, absolutely, but they continued with the school rebuilding programme, unlike in England. Had the Conservatives not cancelled Labour's school rebuilding programme in 2010, every single secondary school in England would have been rebuilt or significantly refurbished by 2020. So think if that had happened, we would not be discussing some of these same schools that are now facing a real challenge at the moment, and school leaders not focusing on getting kids back into the classroom around those wider challenges we've discussed, but managing those mitigations.
But would you commit today then that if Labour wins the election that you would pay for a full school rebuilding programme?
I can't wave a magic wand and put right 13 years of
Well, that's not my question.
failure.
What would you like to do?
Could.
Would you commit to paying for a full school rebuilding programme if you win the election? Because that's what you're criticising them for, cancelling it and not doing it. Would you commit to doing it?
Firstly, we need to know what's going on. That's the important thing. Secondly, as in 1997, it will fall to the next Labour government, if we win the trust of the British people, to rebuild so much of what has gone wrong in our country. Absolutely schools, but GP appointments, the fact that people can't get a good police response. There is so much that is going wrong. And when you've had a government that's been in charge for 13 years, I think a degree of humility on their part in recognising
But I'm asking what you are willing to commit for, because you have very strongly criticised the government for not spending money on rebuilding schools. Would it be something that you will do if you win the election?
There's a lot we'll have to put right. We had a plan, they scrapped it. Had they pressed ahead, we wouldn't be having this conversation. That's the reality of it.
But if you think it's that important, why not commit to it right now?
Because, we would face a really difficult situation around the economy. You heard from Jeremy Hunt, there's basically no growth in the economy. The public finances are in a terrible state. The next Labour government, if we form that government, will face a really tall order. But I am confident that we will put education right back at the heart of the ambition that we have for Britain. It's how you allow people to get on in life. It gives children opportunities.
But because of the economic challenges, you won't commit today to a full...
I can't set out a school rebuilding programme.
You've made that point. I just want to be clear for the audience. One of the things you're calling for as Kids in England Go Back is to make it easier for families to get their school uniform. Now, with your permission, we can't resist but show the audience you all those years ago in your school uniform. I think we can show that image. There you are, off to school in Washington in Tyne and Wear. You're saying that you would want to limit the number of branded items, so the special bits and pieces that families have to buy, whether it's the blazer or the sports kit with a particular logo that can be really expensive. You say you want to limit it to 3 pieces, but why not just get rid of it altogether? Because this can cost a fortune.
Yeah, I think what I'm setting out today is how Labour would limit the number of branded items that school can use, so a maximum of 3 across uniform and PE kit. I think my school uniform was pretty smart. I think the school had pretty high standards around all of that.
You look very proud to be wearing it.
That was my first day of school back in 1995, where coincidentally I was also going to a school building full of these props because of the fact the school was falling down. So there's a certain symmetry about all of this. But the pressures that families are under at the moment are really significant. It's a straightforward way that at a stroke, I would cut the costs that parents are facing. The costs of branded items are going up, and I just don't think there needs to be so many. Schools will still have flexibility, but let's make it easier for parents. Let's cut the costs.
OK, Bridget Phillipson, thanks very much for coming into the studio. It's always great to have you with us, especially with pictures that can take us all back in time. Thank you. Now, all politics and no play could make Sunday a dull day. We don't want that here. So let's talk about a new film from a much-loved actor that will take us all back to the glam rock era of T-Rex, well before Bridget started at school. Boland's Shoes is a bittersweet drama set in 1970s Liverpool and contemporary London. And it stars the familiar face, the actor Timothy Spall. He plays a man whose life's been knocked badly off course, but whose love for Mark Bolan helps him cope. First, we couldn't resist it, a reminder of why the music lives on.
She ain't no witch, and I love the way she twitch, She ain't no witch, and I love the way she twitch, Dirty and sweet, glad and black, don't look back when I love you. You're dirty and sweet, oh yeah. When you dance, when you walk,
There we are, nothing like that on a bit of a Sunday morning to get your toes tapping. Timothy, welcome to the studio. It's great to have you here. Were you a fan of this music during the time?
Oh, I did. I very much like Mark Bolan. I remember he sort of had 2 moments, though. He started out much more of a sort of a folk rock singing. And I remember first hearing his voice and thinking, he sounded like some kind of tainted cherub. It was always a beautiful sound, you know. And then he kind of changed and developed into glam rock, and it was when glam rock came along, and I was a big Bowie fan, and Roxy Music, and all these his whole movement came along, which was he was part of that, and they all changed and developed. So. As was I as a kid, changing and developing.
A big part of your... Did you do the whole thing and the hair and the eyeliner? Did you do that?
I didn't, but I had a friend who was a David Bowie lookalike. I used to dress up in Victorian clothes.
Victorian clothes?
Walk around a King's Road trying to be interesting and failing.
Let's tell us then about your new film.
Well, it's a film that starts in the 70s about a group of kids from a care home in Liverpool going down to see a Mark Bolan concert, T-Rex concert. A brother and sister, a young girl, 10, and her brother are the two main characters in it, and they're all going down, all fully excited, and the boy is looked after by his sister, who's 10. She's quite a toughie. He's a very sensitive, rather, unusual boy. She looks after him, and he's bullied often, and she takes control of a boy who's bullying him and actually nuts him, and on the way, they go to the concert, have a great time, and on the way back, he's bullied again, and there's a terrible accident in the bus. The music is very much Mark Bolan's. So it's not about Mark, but he's the centre of it, because what happens is this terrible tragedy happens on the way back, and they're separated, and it cuts to the modern day.
Let's take a look at the film.
Yes,
then.
OK.
What are you doing in Bristol?
Well, it's the next big place to Cardiff. They found me. Fully clothed, thrashing about in the Millennium Fountains, convinced I was Cary Grant's illegitimate son. We're a bit prone to hallucinations.
Cary Grant?
Yeah, there's a statue to him. Cary. He's a Bristol boy, done good. I clean that too. 72 hours continually in the end.
So it's quite a challenging story in some ways, but what does the film have to tell us about how you move on after tragedy, how people survive?
Well, it really is about that, ultimately. I mean, it's a story about a couple who were split up and in mysterious circumstances. I love Mark Bolan. My character tends it. He's obsessed with looking after the shrine to Mark's that's down in Barnes. They come together because his sister has become a different person. They come together, and it's a story of kind of reconciliation, of that terrible word closure, of finding a way of dealing with this terrible damage that has been done to them through this tragedy, and through what this tragedy on their way back, this accident, has caused their lives to become. My character's got lost. He's been in and out of psychiatric units. He's a drifter. She's actually chosen to live a completely different life. And they're both living in a certain kind of agony. Her in a massive denial because she's changed her identity, and him because he's lost and drifting and is riddled with guilt. And it's their love for each other and kind of the love of Mark Bolan that brings them back together for them to go back on this journey. And there's some big twists in it. I don't want to give too much away. There's also, as you can say, the dialogue is very sharp and witty. So when he talks about his condition, he's actually very witty about it, because they're Scouse people, and that language they have is wonderful. So it's a serious subject, and it covers a lot of ground, but there's also a lot of wit in it.
Bolan Shoes, coming soon. Thank you very much indeed for coming in today. And in case people also haven't seen one of your latest projects, The Sixth Commandment, a drama that's still there on iPlayer, an absolutely extraordinary, quite creepy, but extraordinary and very, very, very worth watching series. Timothy Spall, thank you so much indeed for coming in to talk to us this morning. Now, it is nearly 10 o'clock and we are coming up to the end of the programme. You have, as ever, been in fine voice. You've been feeding in your responses to what you've heard from our politicians here in the studio this morning, particularly on the problem of concrete in schools, hospitals and other public buildings. Ivan Ambrose has been in touch. He says concerns have been raised time and again. People's lives are at risk, and if anything happens, it will be on the head of this Tory government. But Mark from Beverley has told us the Labour Party were in power for a number of years when this happened. Stop just poking the Tories. As ever, we love hearing from you from all sides of the political spectrum. A few minutes just to go before the close of the programme. We are, of course, at the beginning of a big political season. And Rachel, I know you keep a sharp eye on all of the politicians. Do you think the welfare of the younger generations is looked after properly by the current political establishment?
Absolutely not at the moment. And in fact, when I talk to children, despite best intentions, I think everyone has been distracted with multiple prime ministers, economy. When I talk to children, they tell me how ambitious they are for their futures, for jobs. They want a great economy, they want to do good things, but we have to put the support in for them now. And in fact, they're crying out for support, especially the most vulnerable. And that means thinking about things like school buildings, thinking about supporting them back to school, thinking about the mental health support they need to get there and making sure everyone's working together for it, and just the help with education. It's tough. It's tough being between 14 and 21 and being on that exam cycle. I'm also most concerned about our most vulnerable. That data didn't show that half of children in special needs schools are not back. Half of children with a social worker are not back. We must focus on the most vulnerable and those not living at home with their parents and make sure the support's there. As a nation, I'm sure we want to do this, and I want the politicians, we need to be telling the politicians to do this.
Well, you've been here to do that this morning. Hugh, what do you think?
Well, I totally agree with Rachel, but one thing we need to do for the young people of today is protect them from the devastating effects of the climate crisis. And there's an opportunity to do that this coming week. I mean, it only takes one spanner to stop a wind turbine, and that spanner has been Grant Shapps. He's gone. Next week, there's an opportunity to lift the ban on onshore wind and give us much more energy security and cheaper electricity bills, and to fight the climate crisis, which is absolutely at the heart of this. It's not just about the energy in the moment, it's about the future of our young people, so we have to do it.
And Piers, what do you reckon this political season is going to look like? And do you think Rishi Sunak would have paid attention to any of the advice that you gave him when you were jetting over the Atlantic?
Well, I hope he does, because I do think, I mean, look, I think in relation to kids, I've got 4 kids myself. I just think we've got to try and toughen kids up to deal with normal life. There's an epidemic of anxiety. There's an inability of a lot of young people to just get through normal life. And I just don't think we're going about this in the right way. And people get angry when I say this kind of thing, but I really see it, and I'm very concerned about it. I hope the Prime Minister sees that too. I think as a country, as a people, we've got to get back on the front foot. We've got to start believing in ourselves. We've got to start punching the air a bit and getting more aggressive and getting more exciting and turn this country back into the Great Britain we all want it to be. And I just don't see enough at the moment of that kind of energy. I see a lot of people talking down the country, a lot of despondency in the air. Rightly, there's a lot of issues to deal with, but we've come through a lot tougher times than this. And I think generally with politics, look, Rishi Sunak has got, what, a year and 4 months to call an election.
Maybe not.
We know a week is a long time in politics, and not just here. I've just been in America last week. What's going on there with Donald Trump and Joe Biden? I mean, Trump is facing nearly 100 criminal charges, and yet he could still win the presidency and perhaps actually run the country from a prison cell. So we think we've got problems.
Other story.
Think about that.
My goodness, that's a whole other story.
And you can watch all of it on Piers Morgan Uncensored from tomorrow night.
We got through without a plug. It's been wonderful to have all of you here with us on BBC One. It's all we've got time for. It is wonderful to be back with you for this new political season, which will be full of all sorts of intrigue and excitement, no doubt, and no despondency in this studio. We don't allow that because we like to have good conversations with you. But it is crystal clear that Downing Street has an urgent problem with the crumbling condition of some public buildings. And the danger, as we've heard in this studio, is it gives their rivals the perfect metaphor for the Tories' long-term issues. Of course, you can catch up with anything you missed on iPlayer. And for the first time on a Sunday, take a look at this. Is he there, I hope? Yes, there is Paddy O'Connell, my new podcasting partner, finishing up on Radio 4. In a few minutes, we'll meet in the newscast studio for our first ever Sunday episode, where we will chew over the morning's big headlines and maybe, if you're good, give you the inside track. That will be available on BBC Sounds from lunchtime. And as you know, every now and again, we like to give you something here on Sundays that is just unashamedly beautiful, just because we can. So to mark our first weekend back and the last night of the proms coming up, here is the young British cellist who has become an international star, Sheku Kanneh-Mason. This is the star of the County Down. It's just a gorgeous way to say goodbye. I'll see you next week.
Discover unique stories.